Alrighty, good afternoon. What we're going to do today is we're going to do an alternate form of the 1.03 pH in Minnesota lakes lab, and we're going to discuss how acidity in Minnesota lakes affects the organisms that live inside of those lakes. And so if you're not familiar with the pH scale shows us how much acid is in something. And just as a quick question, what level on the pH scale do you think is the most acidic? From 0 to actually 14. Which level do you think is the most acidic? It is level 0, kind of where battery acid is, and stomach acid. It's stuff that can digest your food really easily because it's really acidic. And so that shows us how much acid is in something, whereas up top here we've got liquid drain cleaner, caustic sodas, soapy waters. They're very alkaline. Either end of the pH scale can be hazardous for humans to consume. And so understanding how pH works helps us in a lot of ways. If you work in the food industry, for food and beverage, dairy production, processing, in the field, if you want to maintain a pool, if you have a pool, you probably have measured the pH because it's important. Drinking water, rivers, oceans, lakes, we're going to focus on that today. Petrochemicals. If you research in the lab environment, design cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, things, you want to make sure that they're safe for human consumption. Plants and animal sciences, soil testing, hydroponics, as you can see, biofuels even. There are tons of applications for understanding how pH works, and so it's important to understand that. And what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at how it affects rivers, oceans, and aquatic ecosystems. So humans, animals, and plants handle pH in different ways. And so we need to consume a mixture of acids and bases in order to keep our blood pH at the right levels. And so if you're like me, your blood should be between 7.35 to 7.45. If it's not, over time you could suffer health problems. And so our body fortunately has what's called a buffer, which allows us to kind of buffer the amount of pH, the amount of acid and bases in our body. And that allows us basically to say, hey, we can stay within this range. But sometimes it can get more extreme than that. And if you're in an environment where pH changes rapidly, things can shift. So the purpose of today's lab, and we're going to do an abridged version of this, is to explore how changing the pH of water affects creatures that live in the water. And we'll apply that knowledge to real-world situations that are happening today. And so the goal of what we're going to do is first, I'm going to have you do a hypothesis. What do you think is going to happen? So what I want you to think of right now is, what is going to happen to these creatures? Do you think they're all going to die at the same time when we expose them to a certain amount of acid? Do you think they're all going to die at a different time? What do you think? Next, we're going to do a collection of pH tolerance for 3 aquatic species. And then we're going to analyze that data, and you're going to answer some questions. Okay? So that is how that is going to roll. And then there will be on your own questions that we'll talk about. So let's go ahead and move over to Google Chrome here, where we've got our species. And what I want you to do is I want you to focus on what happens to each of these species as we add acids to this tank. So as you can see, we've got a snail, we've got a leech, and we've got a crayfish. And they all will respond to a change in acidity in the water because that's where they live. And so we start off with a pH of 7. And remember, the lower we go down on the pH scale, the more acidic the environment is. So as we add pH, we're going to drop that number. This is measuring what the amount of acid in the water. Remember, the closer to 0, the more acidic the water is. And so we have this solution. And predict real quick which species you think is going to kick the bucket first. So we'll put in a few drops here, drop the pH to 6.7. The crayfish dropped down how many units? We started off with 20. The crayfish dropped down a total of 8 units. With the snail, we also had a decrease of 10 units. What happened with the leech? Let's add a little bit more acid. We dropped the pH to 6.4. What happened to the snail and the crayfish? At what point do you think the leech is going to die? We're at pH of 6.1. pH of 5.8. Pretty hardy creatures. pH of 5.5. So this is pretty acidic water now. Okay, we've lost 1 at 5.2. Ah, okay, at 4.9 we've lost 12 leeches. And at 4.6, everything's gone. And so there's a series of questions that you'll answer through here real quick in Educanon. All right, so what we've done is we have collected pH tolerance data for 3 aquatic species or more. We've just kind of looked at them. Which ones went first, which ones went last. I had wanted you to keep track of that. And then we're going to do an analysis of data and conclusions to real-world situations. And so what I want to do is mainly focus on conclusions to real-world situations, but there are questions that were already built in that where we analyze the data that we collected. So on your own question, and this will also be an Educanon for you to answer, you're monitoring Birch Lake, which is a small northern Minnesota lake that has a healthy walleye population. Walleye prefer to feed on crayfish and snails. In fact, that's what they usually feed on. So the lake you're going to monitor has a pH of 7.3, so it's pretty standard. Walleye can handle a pH range of 6 to 9. Crayfish can handle a pH range of 6.5 to 8. Snails can handle a pH range of 6.4 to 8. The nearby Polymet copper mine, if approved, would release acids into surrounding waters, most likely, and bring down the pH of lakes nearby to about 6.2. So taking a look at the values in the pH tolerance for these creatures, what species in this example would not survive in Birch Lake at a pH of 6.2? If you said the crayfish and the snails, you were correct, as Educanon probably told you. Once those species die out, what will happen to the walleye? The walleye will die as well because they will starve. And so when we interrupt the natural cycles by adding additional acids into water through acid rain or through copper mining or whatever, we can disturb the ecosystem in many different ways. And every creature reacts in a slightly different way. But if we disrupt a creature on the food chain in one spot, the other spot, there will be other creatures that will be affected. Okay, this next question. The zebra mussel is invasive to Minnesota lakes and causes a lot of problems. It can survive in an environment with a pH of 6.5 to 9. So that's its range of tolerance, 6.5 to 9. Your friend suggests that the Minnesota DNR should add large amounts of acid to lakes that have zebra mussels. This would decrease the pH of those lakes to less than 6.5 and would kill the zebra mussel population. Is this a good idea? Why or why not? And there's a question that'll pop up in Educanon now. Okay, so this is probably not a good idea because we have to take into consideration the other creatures that are living in the lake, and a lot of them do not have a pH tolerance of less than 6.5, and so they would die too, and that would throw off a lot of things, and then eventually you'd have to treat the lake for acidity, and that would be a problem. All right, numero 9. You work for the Minnesota DNR and are doing research on the pH tolerance of invasive species in Minnesota lakes. So here are the results that you've found through experimentation. What species has the highest and best tolerance to pH changes? So the zebra mussel, 6.5 to 9. Eurasian water milfoil, 5.4 to 11. Curly leaf pondweed, 6.6 to 9.9. Silver carp, 5.5 to 9.0. The faucet snail, 6.6 to 8.5. So which species has the best tolerance to a change in pH? So you'll want to look at the range here to determine this. And there will be a question that will pop up here. All right, fantastic. So if we go back here real quick and we refresh this, there's a few minutes left of recording ability here, we can use different species to determine different types of tolerances. And once again, as we're taking a look here, the crayfish always seems to be very sensitive, and so they're pretty important species, and they're common in Minnesota lakes. So if they disappear, that creates a problem for walleye and other fish that feed on crayfish, which then can decrease the fishery, which can cause us to have problems finding fish food and things like that. So it's really kind of an important thing to understand how these affect these issues affect us in many more ways than it seems. And so if we take a look, we see that by 5.2, the dragonfly nymph, in this case, in the second example, is gone. The crayfish is already long gone. The worms, though, worms can survive a very long time. So if anybody ever tells you that worms, if the worms survive, then there's food for the fish, that's not true, because there won't be any fish left at these pHs. And so the worm, as you can see, can survive into a pretty acidic environment overall. So that's kind of the point there. All right. So hopefully you enjoyed this